After weeks of buildup, Ukraine says it has launched a counteroffensive to retake territory seized by Russia in the first weeks of its invasion. Officials in Kyiv said their forces have broken through Moscow's defenses in several areas of the front line near the city of Kherson. As the pushback got underway, the EU agreed on launching its own new mission to provide additional military assistance to Ukraine. So we're asking today, Ukraine counteroffensive, can Kyiv push the Russian army back? Welcome to The Point. It is a pleasure to greet our guests. Marina Henke is professor for international relations at the Berlin-based Hertie School, and she's also director of its Center for International Security. And a warm welcome back to the program to Christoph von Marschall. He is diplomatic correspondent for the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel. And Nick Connolly is DW's Ukraine correspondent. He's been covering the war on location since it began. Let me start out by asking all of you to give us your take on what's actually happening on the ground, because we haven't been getting a lot of information or images coming from the region around Kherson. So, Nick, what are you hearing? Are officials in Kyiv giving us accurate reports in terms of both the counteroffensive having started and also having broken through Russia's front lines? And how would you assess the potential?
They're keeping very quiet, and they said that they will keep quiet until they have kind of concrete results. So I think there's not much sense expecting detail from those official speakers. We are seeing lots of images on social media of explosions, of things we've seen in recent weeks, but just being intensified. So the Ukrainians really using their high-tech Western weapons to destroy Russia's logistics, to go after weapons depots, to try and really knock out those bridges across the Dnipro River, to basically trap the Russian troops around Kherson on the west bank of that very, very wide Dnipro River. I'm still in touch with some people who have stayed there, who haven't left, and they are basically not leaving their houses. They are staying put, having previously lived in a situation where it was basically every evening artillery kind of fire around 9-10 p.m. It now seems to be pretty much all day. And the people there are just sitting put and hoping that this kind of passes them without too much in the way of devastation for the civilian population.
Although officials in Kyiv have actually just said that people should be leaving, that they, at least before the cold weather gets there. I
mean, that's definitely been the call along, to encourage people to leave, but the question is how. So the safest route has, for now, until now, been through Russian-annexed Crimea, and then people have been travelling often extraordinary lengths through Crimea, through Russia, Georgia, Turkey, to get to Ukrainian-controlled territory. The more direct route to Ukrainian-controlled territory was basically unmarked. There was no kind of corridor. People were reporting being also basically ransomed by the Russian troops, them not letting people leave with cash and other valuables, and often getting in very dangerous situations. So it's a pretty precarious situation, and I think the people I've been talking to are saying they feel safest in their cellars.
Marina, the Russian Defense Ministry has actually now acknowledged that a counteroffensive has begun, but it says it, quote-unquote, failed miserably, and that Ukrainian forces have sustained heavy casualties. Just Russian disinformation, or what are you hearing?
What I'm hearing is that the morale is very high among the Ukrainian troops, very strong fighting spirit, that they're also counting on the local population, the Ukrainian population that actually had an active resistance to the Russian occupation. So they're counting on them to deliver intelligence on Russian positions in the city. And that overall, that the Ukrainians really think that they can, at least push forward. This is also very important from a political point of view. They want to signal to Western supporters, to NATO, to the United States, that they can take back territory and that they can win this war.
Exactly, and I want to come back to that point in a moment. Christoph, why is Kherson strategically and also military important? What's the significance of the fact that the counteroffensive begins here near Kherson?
Well, first, it's the location at the riverside of the Dnipro, the very broad river, and then generally it's about getting the south of Ukraine back, and this is the region with all the ports to the Black Sea. That is very important, not only for corn to export, which we have heard, but generally the Ukrainian economy needs access to ports in order to function. And At the moment, most of the ports are blocked by Russian troops or taken and occupied. So this is strategically important. Now the third theater, at the beginning of the war 6 months ago, we saw the Battle of Kyiv. Then after a few weeks, it changed to the east, to the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. And now the south becomes the main battlefield. And it's important for Kyiv to show, as the title of this program, that they are able to push back. It's an additional question whether they will be able to push out the Russians. I'm not so sure about that, but pushing back is important to give signals that it makes sense to deliver weapons to Ukraine.
Nick, does Kherson also have symbolic, emotional significance for Ukrainians?
Well, definitely, because it's the first big Ukrainian city that was taken by the Russians at the beginning of this war, and there was also a lot of seemingly failures on the part of the Ukrainian security services, senior Ukrainian officials cooperating with the Russians. Some of the bridges leading from Crimea had been mined in the run-up to the war, but then suddenly, when the Russians appeared, those mines were gone. President Zelensky has fired several top security officials who are responsible for that region. So there's real, I think, kind of bad blood and a feeling of shame among lots of high officials in Ukraine that they weren't able to kind of root out these collaborators in the lead up to this war. So I think there's definitely that need to kind of show some successes to the population. But also this is a reachable and attainable goal. This is a quite comparatively small chunk of territory, all on the right-hand side of the Dnipro River. So, compared to trying to take all of the south back, this is something that is easily definable, and we've heard reports that the American military advisors to Ukraine had actually pushed for the Ukrainians to limit their ambition and to really focus on kind of more attainable goals rather than trying to do too much on too many fronts.
Kherson was, in fact, taken, as mentioned, in the early weeks of the war as events were moving very fast. But deadlock soon set in. Success in retaking Kherson could break a long stalemate during which neither side managed to make meaningful territorial gains.
The goal is to recapture lost territories. The battle in the Kherson region has begun. Seen here, pictures of its preparation. Kyiv reports that some villages have already been liberated. If the Russian military wants to survive, now is the time for Russian soldiers to flee, to go home. If the occupiers are afraid to return home to Russia, then let them surrender. We guarantee them compliance with all Geneva Convention norms. In recent days, Russia had stepped up its attacks on Ukraine, shelling Slovyansk and Kharkiv in the east of the country. Residential areas were also hit, with many houses completely destroyed. According to British intelligence, Putin had hoped the intensified attacks would tie down Ukrainian troops in the east, weakening the counteroffensive in the south. But that plan appears to have failed. The Ukrainian counterstrike has begun. Can Ukraine win this war?
Marina, that's a $64 million question. What would you say?
Well, the big advantage of the Ukrainians is that they have very modern weapon systems now. And why are they superior to what the Russians have? Well, it's actually because they're precision guided. They can hit from a very long distance weapon depots and Russian military positions. The Russians used to have a lot of weapon systems and also a lot of ammunition, but basically they're shooting blind. And as long as the West delivers those weapons and as long as the Ukrainians can make use of them, sort of trained to use them, and this is what you mentioned also before, the EU mission to train them, I think the Ukrainians have a real shot at, at least pushing them back. Pushing them out is a harder question, but pushing them back. And here, actually, that's also one of the successes of the sanction regime, because Russia cannot build those really high modern weapon systems right now because they require microchips. And this is one item where they really rely on U.S. imports or from South Korea, from Taiwan. The quality of the Chinese chip is much inferior. So yes, Ukraine, has to a certain degree a chance, but of course, there's a massive dependence on the imports from the West. And so the big question is, will we continue supporting Ukraine?
And we're going to come back to that later on. But let me ask a few more questions about the counteroffensive itself. Nick, what would have to happen strategically for this counteroffensive to succeed, for it to become a major step toward Ukraine winning this war?
Well, I mean, I think, firstly, they're trying to knock out those Russian communications across the Dnieper River, so to kind of cut off the garrison in Kherson from supply lines from Crimea, from places further east. So that is kind of a crucial target, and it seems like the bridges there are very severely damaged, and the Russians having to use ferries, pontoons across very wide rivers. I wouldn't want to be on those ferries. They move very slowly over a very wide river. They are sitting targets, and the Ukrainians, thanks to American intelligence, see basically everything that the Russians are doing there, and the distances really aren't that big from those Ukrainian front positions. I think it's also about Ukraine getting enough ammunition for these HIMARS rocket artillery systems. I think that is a picture of the launch of one of those systems. Up till now, Ukraine has had to really, really judge very carefully when they use these high-tech weapons, but they just weren't getting the numbers that they were asking for in terms of refill from the American side. Now we've had reports, even from Russian Telegram channels, saying that the Ukrainians are using those HIMARS systems a lot more liberally, seemingly are not having to be quite as economical, where they're using them even against personnel, against Russian troops in trenches rather than just against kind of high-value targets. So it does seem like Ukraine now, at least in this part of the battlefield, is somewhere close to parity in terms of weapons and is not having to kind of play kind of on the back foot, kind of catch up as it has been in other places.
Kyiv, nonetheless, Christoph, has been doing some expectation management in terms of the timetable, saying that progress is likely to be slow. To what degree is Ukraine under time pressure here? We've got cold weather coming, I mentioned it earlier, and also Putin is planning to hold a sham referendum in the south to try to create a justification for the occupation. Does that mean that, in a sense, Kyiv's got its back up against a wall when it comes to timing?
Timing is important, and there's an interconnection between timing inside Ukraine, timing within the weather zones, timing with Western countries, and the willingness to supply further aid. So they have to show some military success in order to keep up the willingness not only of the governments but of Western societies to support this type of policy. Here in Germany, we are now talking about a winter when people might be freezing in homes because there's not enough gas or whatever, or it's so expensive. And that could decrease the support, the political support that Western countries still want to give Ukraine the weapons to push back the Russians, and even maybe at some point to push them out of occupied territory. So if there are no signs of success, then the Western willingness in the societies to say, yeah, it's worse to fight the war with Russia and to support Ukraine would decrease. And I think that is the most important factor.
Marina, let me, before we drill deeper on that, let me ask a bit about the Russian side of all of this. Russia has now said that it could reinforce its troops to 130,000 in January, yet Putin has avoided either general mobilization or conscription. Why is that? What's going on?
Well, it shows that actually this war isn't as popular as Russian wants it to be. A general mobilization would require that Putin says, this is a war, we are at war, Russia is at war, and then he can justify a full mobilization of the country. But in Russia, this war, de facto war, is still called a special military operation, and so he tries, with all means to somehow, get to that stage of war, and it shows that, he's afraid to take that step. But, I'm very skeptical that he can actually reach the target of 170,000 new troops. There are various techniques he uses. So, for example, he tries to incentivize conscripts so that they sign up for a permanent or a more permanent contract.
In fact, apparently, some coming from prisons, convicted felons are being recruited.
That's what U.S. intelligence exactly reported. Also, they try to get at those mercenaries, right? The Wagner group, try to integrate them in the Russian army. But the big question is, when we talk about defensive positions and offensive position, to have a successful offensive, you need to have a troop advantage of, a ratio of 3 to 1, meaning the Ukrainian side needs 3 times more troops than Russia. Or, if Russia wants to keep its defensive position, it needs to have this troop advantage. And that's why the troop question and how many soldiers are there is so critical on both sides, by the way.
Nick, what are you hearing about Russian morale? We heard Marina say that morale among Ukrainian troops is quite high. Perhaps you can confirm that as well. But what about on the Russian side?
I mean, definitely this is, incomparable. Obviously, the Ukrainians are fighting at home. They know why they're fighting. And also, in a way, Vladimir Putin has made it easier for the Ukrainians because he said before this war that basically his goal is to get rid of this country, to end Ukraine as an independent entity. So they know what they're fighting for. They're fighting for the existence of their country. We've had lots of reports from at least Ukrainian sources of Russians being pretty eager to be taken prisoner, to get away from their own commanders. The situation is particularly bad with people who've been forced to fight, people from Donetsk and Luhansk, who are often treated much worse and given
from the east of the country.
So from eastern Ukrainian regions that have been under de facto Russian control since 2014, and these people they're sent in units that are controlled by these quasi-republics, and they are much worse supplied in terms of equipment, in terms of finances, and they are often sent to the most dangerous parts of the front lines. And there are reports there of mutinies of the troops often using violence against their own commanders, and a lot of tension. Some of that may be Ukrainian propaganda, but it does seem, there are videos of families in Donetsk trying to prevent their men being conscripted, going to the government offices demanding that their sons be sent home. So I think there is a real problem there.
Just remind us, because of course you have been reporting on the ground, and again you've emphasized in that reporting how bloody and cruel this conflict is. Can you just give us a sense of what you've seen in these months?
I mean, at the beginning of the war, we were in Kyiv and we were hearing the artillery fire in places like Bucha and Irpin that we all then later saw images of the extraordinary violence used towards civilians there. We couldn't get there. We were basically at a bridge that had been destroyed, and we were looking across, seeing the artillery fire, seeing people desperate to get out. I remember standing at this destroyed bridge and people carrying their grandmother on a stretcher across the destroyed bridge while the artillery fire was going on. People were losing their lives while trying to get out. And then obviously once it had been retaken by the Ukrainian forces, seeing the devastation, seeing what those Russian troops had done there, seeing pools of blood just kind of where basically at every turn, the mass graves there. I think the scariest thing for civilians is just quite, at least in the early months of the war, quite how unpredictable it was. The front was moving a lot of the time. It's very difficult, if you're not experienced in these military things, to understand where the artillery fire is coming from, what direction it's going in. So people were just living in a kind of permanent sense of high alert. But on the other hand, strangely enough, people are often very, very unwilling to leave their homes until it's often too late. So time and time again, hearing stories of people losing their lives, or people trying to help others evacuate, being wounded because people just refused to believe that this was going to touch them until basically the fire was kind of within view of their houses.
In a word, if Russia is now going to resort to more mercenaries, to convicted felons, would you expect the cruelty and the possibility of war crimes to rise?
I mean, I think that's definitely what ordinary Ukrainian citizens expect. They are often, pretty desperate to get to Ukrainian-controlled territories, whatever the price may be, and lots of people are just hunkering down and staying at home and trying to avoid leaving home do that as rarely as possible. There really is no kind of clarity on what the rules of engagement are for civilians in this conflict.
So all of you have mentioned how crucially important Western weapons are to ensuring that this counteroffensive can make progress. And it's become something of a mantra in Kyiv, as well as among Ukraine's friends in the West. If Putin is to be defeated, Western weapons need to keep coming. The EU appears to have heard that call. Shortly after the war began, it took the unprecedented step of offering 500 million euros in direct funding for military assistance. And now member states, including Germany, say they're ready to do more.
Sending German heavy weapons into conflict zones is no longer taboo. Chancellor Olaf Scholz speaks of a turning point. Ukrainian soldiers are to be brought to Germany to learn how to operate a Gepard tank. Berlin plans on sending 30 such anti-aircraft tanks plus ammunition to Ukraine. We will offer Ukraine economic, financial, political, humanitarian, and also military support. We will maintain this support for as long as is necessary. And after much back and forth, the so-called ring swap has also been finalized. Germany will supply the Czech Republic with Leopard 2 battle tanks. In return, Prague will send Soviet-era T-72 tanks to Ukraine, where Ukrainian soldiers can operate them without instruction. Can modern Western weapons push back the Russian army?
Let me put that question straight to Christoph, but also couple it with a question about German support, because Germany has been criticized for being slow and equivocal in its follow-through on its promises of support. Is that changing?
It is changing, but not fast enough, and not. It's too little, too late. If somebody is saving the Ukrainian army, it's certainly not Germany, it's certainly not the European Union. It is the US mainly, and the British, and some help from Poland and Baltic states. And that is, of course, a little bit a shame. The change came far too late. Scholz, Chancellor, was not so sure about the public support in Germany. There's always this idealism that we should come to a political agreement, that this war should be ended by negotiations. But the situation on the ground is a precondition for any talks. And I think Ukraine needs to regain territory in order that they have a real chance at the negotiation table.
Supposedly, Germany's hesitancy also has to do with fears on the part of the Chancellor and others that if Germany and the EU go too far in delivering heavy combat weapons, that it could pull NATO into what Scholz sometimes refers to as World War III.
I don't think that that is a fair assessment. Germany is not delivering enough, that this is a real danger for Vladimir Putin. Germany is a weak point in the whole political discussion. If Putin would like really to threaten the West, he should threaten the United States, because they are delivering the weapons which are needed. And the European Union provides money, and that is good that they are providing money, but they don't provide weapons, because the European Union has no weapons on stock. They just can give money to Ukraine. And if you compare, if you say, well, another €500 million, and that is not very much for days or weeks of war. The West has to deliver weapons in the range of several $1 billion every month, and not just millions.
Marina, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I also agree with Mr. Marshall, because, Germany thinks that it's really the kind of like the decider in this war. But, if Russia wanted to escalate, it would escalate because the Americans are, doing steps that, are perceived from the Russian side as escalatory. So Germany is not, the linchpin in this battle.
Can I just ask briefly, if you would, how convinced you are that Europe and Germany are going to keep the support coming, even as we move into a cold and tough winter where gas supplies are dwindling, where energy prices are soaring, and governments are having to give out billions in relief packages?
I'm pretty convinced that Germany will make the right decisions, but it will not be wholeheartedly. It will be always with a lot of hesitancy, and also that sends signals. It sends signals to the United States, but also, sometimes maybe even more importantly, to our eastern neighbors. That's Poland, that's the Baltic states. And I think they will come out of this war thinking, can we really trust Germany? Can we also trust France going forward, also in a European and an EU context? And I think that's the real conclusion of that debate.
Let me just very briefly ask us to talk a little bit about the bigger picture. And I want to tie that to another offer that we heard from Chancellor Scholz this week on a trip to the Czech Republic. He called for a new joint air defense system for Europe to enhance the continent's security. Nick, do you think that would significantly improve defense and deterrence for Europe as a whole if Russia's imperial revanchism sets its sights on targets beyond Ukraine?
I think it's a question also of the timelines, when this is actually going to happen. We've seen lots of fairly seemingly impressive announcements in terms of defence from Chancellor Scholz and from the German establishment. But when you then dig a bit deeper, you kind of ask yourself, is this going to be realistic within the next 5 years? I think there's still no way around NATO. I think the American deterrent is still crucial to all of this. And for now, we saw Germany announce €100 billion in extra spending for defence. But still, if you look at the years beyond that and take these 100 billion out of the equation, Germany is still not planning to reach the 2% of GDP contribution, to its defence. So I'm kind of hesitant, and I think lots of people further east in Poland and let alone Ukraine are still very sceptical that Germany and France are willing to step up and to basically look after their own security, without that American support, even though America, is very tied up in the Pacific.
Christoph, staying with the big picture, Mikhail Gorbachev died this week. He was the author of the vision of a common European home and a Europe whole and free. Did Putin's invasion in February put an end to that vision for good?
I think even Gorbachev was not really as he's seen in Germany as a big European peace fighter. He wanted to maintain Soviet power, the Soviet Union, and we were lucky enough that he didn't shed blood in Berlin and in Prague and in Warsaw, but he did it in Lithuania and Latvia and so on. So I think containment is the main strategy we need, and that means Europe has to contain Russia because the US might have all the hands full with containing China.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. And thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.